Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, again, transition wise. As a police officer, you kind of look at threat and risk and think this is what we need to mitigate that. When you work in the private sector, somebody says, that's your budget, that's how I want it to be done.
Welcome to the Circuit Magazine, the #1 source of information on protection matters, the industry-leading magazine for all security professionals who want to stay ahead of the game.
Transitioning from the police to the private sector in executive protection. Today, Sean West and myself, we're going to be talking with Scott Hamer, recently moved from the Royalty and Specialist Protection division of the Met Police all the way to the private sector. So very much in transition. And I think this element of one's career will resonate with a lot of people, even if they haven't actually worked in the police, Sean. Where do you think we can go with today's session?
No, I totally agree. I mean, anyone from that background, who's worked at such a high level, in royalty protection, police protection, it's always, fascinating to hear their story, what they've done in the past, and how they're making the transition into the private sector. There's so much we can all learn from what he's done, what he's experienced, the lessons he's learned, and what he brings to the table. So I think it's going to be good to hear about the transition, how he's felt the transition's gone from police to private sector, the lessons he's learned, and what lessons he can give to people who are already serving within the sector.
And for me, this ties in nicely with a previous episode from season 1 of the Circuit Magazine podcast with Carlos Francisco, the corporate security translator, because I think this plays out across the world. This element of being in a big superstructure organization and then being on your own. The element of having a lot of resources and then not. Having a lot of authority and then maybe not. I wonder, does that play out in a lot of people's minds?
Moving from the police or the military to, I wouldn't say a smaller organisation, but to the private sector, in the military or police, you will have lots of resources that you can call upon. And I think it's just an adjustment of expectation. And you have to realise you don't have the big organisations to fall upon, and it's a lesson I learned pretty quickly when I got into the sector. When I first transitioned from the military into the private sector, I went out to hostile environments, and sadly, I was in an incident where someone lost their life. And in the military, when these incidents happen, you had a big organisation to call upon, but when you're in the private sector, it was completely different. And a story where we had American support from the American military, and we had a American individual there who got injured during this incident, who they took away. But sadly, the person who lost their life, they said, he's not with us. This is your responsibility, and we had to unfortunately take care of it ourselves and take the guy back. Unfortunately, back into the camp ourselves within our own vehicles, within our own convoy. And it was just a sharp lesson that I learned that, wow, we really are on our own now. We don't have this big backup and support, which we once previously did. And it can be a shock to the system if you're working in a hostile sector, for sure. But not so much private sector, but you definitely don't, you haven't got them same resources. So you have to make your resources go further and position people correctly, get the right caliber of guy or girl. You just haven't got the endless resources. So you have to be more thoughtful, a bit more strategic, I think, in how you carry out the function of executive protection.
Well, that paints quite a broad spectrum, of course, because there would be people now in the private sector in the hostile, in the hot zones, and people in more sanguine sort of environments, and then people somewhere in between working big events like Scott at the moment. So let's hear from Scott then, and let's take a snapshot of his transition as it's going on, and I'm sure it will resonate with a lot of the audience, even if they've never worked in the police. So this is Scott Hamer and transitioning from the police to the private sector EP world.
And now, let's meet one of the contributors to the Circuit magazine.
Today, we're talking transitioning from the police to the private sector. And Sean West and myself, we are delighted to welcome Scott Hamer, former royalty and specialist protection professional, who is on that very journey. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you on. How are you doing?
Good morning to you both. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, let's get into it, because, of course, there's lots to explore. You've got an illustrious career, but let's tackle this topic, transitioning from the police to the private sector. You're in the middle of it, but what's the biggest challenge or sort of problem as you see it now?
Well, I suppose, I mean, for me, the transition might have been a little bit easier, because even though I was a serving police officer and involved in close protection, for a period of time, I did have my own company. So I have seen a little bit of the private sector beforehand. I think for me, some of the things that myself and other colleagues have faced in the past is kind of depolicing your CV. That's probably one of the most important things that somebody told me. There's a lot of courses that you can do within the police, a lot of experience, a lot of training, but you need to, change the wording, change the parlance, so it's understood in the private sector. That's probably one thing. And then the other thing, and this is my view, certainly as a police officer, when you've done 30 years, you retire and you can rely on a good pension. And, maybe there's some reluctance from the private sector to employ you because they think that you're just topping up your pension, or that you might not be serious enough. So that's one of the things that I think I've come across, and certainly other people have. And that's true. I mean, I've worked with a lot of police officers over the years. There's some that work incredibly hard, and there's some that hardly work. And, unfortunately, I know some of my colleagues have been employed in positions in the past when they might not have been the hardest of workers. And sometimes that gets a bad reputation for those that are retiring from the police. I don't know if you can verify any of those stories.
No, I don't know. Obviously, I have no opinion. But yeah, what about you? Where does your passion for protection come from?
I don't really know. I mean, look, from being a young boy, longer than I can ever remember, I always wanted to be a police officer. And that was kind of in my DNA. My uncle was a police officer, but I come from a family of butchers. My father and my grandfather were both butchers. It was expected that I'd go into the family business, but I always wanted to be a police officer. Liked helping people, liked protecting people, liked doing the right thing. And it's probably true of many protection officers. A good police officer makes a good protection officer. So yeah, I think my first introduction to protection was in 2001 when I joined royalty protection as it was. And I was lucky enough to know a couple of people who I'd worked with as an ordinary police officer, on the streets of London in Paddington and Harrow Road, who were in the department. So that was kind of my introduction to it. And it was ironic, really, because, and I've still got this book, actually. I got a Ladybird book from 1981 from the then Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales marriage. And I remember looking at that and seeing in the book, that one of the chaps sat on the back of the carriage was a police officer, and I ended up working with him, which was quite interesting, looking back on that little story.
No, fantastic. No, and I hope many of the audience can resonate with that, even if they're not from the police. And so, what about the people who are completely uninitiated? And by that, I'm thinking protectors in the world of protection who've never really thought about this challenge of transitioning, and I suppose those still in the police who are contemplating it. What should they really know?
What about the transition, or?
Yeah, about this transition, because I suppose they could be kinder to their colleague that has been transitioning, and if they're going to transition, they'd be like, "Oh, well, what should I think about?"
I think the first thing to consider, as I said earlier, is your CV. It's really easy to, to speak in police language, say the thing, it's a language in itself. Sometimes that doesn't transfer across to the private sector unless somebody comes from that background. So it's de-policing your CV, I would think. You can say the same things, you just need to say them in different ways. You can get help with that. There's professional services around. I know I didn't particularly do that. I mean, I just got somebody who was ex-police who's been in the private sector for a number of years to have a look at my CV, and he certainly helped me with that. That'd be my first piece of advice. And then the second, I suppose, again, a lot of jobs, as we all know, come on recommendations. You can. I've thrown my hat into the ring for some random things and got through to the very final few. But generally, throughout my career and throughout life, a lot of what you achieve is on recommendation. So, it's doing the right thing, being good at what you do, getting a good name for yourself, continual, personal and professional development. All those things will definitely help. But, life being as it is, a lot of things do come on recommendations from people who either known you before and work with you, or those that know somebody who's worked with you. And on that, you can take that two ways, because, throughout my career, I've worked with people who love me and both hate me. What you're looking for is a fair appraisal of your, your skills and what you're actually like.
So I guess, what has surprised you most within your current transition to the private sector? What can you tell us about your current role, and what's the biggest surprise?
So I've gone from your police protection to the private security generally. So my current role is I'm employed by the Commonwealth Games, Birmingham 2022, and I'm the venue security manager for the Alexander Stadium and the opening and closing ceremonies, including all the visiting VIPs. So that's the easy part, because that's similar to what I used to do. And I'm working with my old colleagues from RASP, Royalty and Specialist Protection. But the thing that I really noticed, and I've noticed this prior to my transition and when I had my own company, is the difference between private security and government provided security. And when I say that, I'm not saying that you can have professional people across all walks, all forms, but certainly in the police or the military world, you can rely on individuals to do something. Now, that might be because of their individual characteristics, or it might be because there's a fear of discipline at the end of it. So, in a police protection capacity, if I tell somebody to stand on a post or do something for a period of time until they're relieved, then I know that will be done. And the same is probably relevant to the military as well. In the private sector, and certainly some of the private, security operations I've been involved in, not just in the Commonwealth Games, but in my previous business life as well. When it comes to the end of the day, when it comes to 7 o'clock shift changeover, that's it. And I'm not saying everybody, there's still a lot of, integrity within that private sector. But, some people will just literally walk off the post. They've been paid for that 12 hours, that's it, they're gone. And if they've not been relieved on time, they walk. And that's quite surprising to me, because, personally, that's not something I would do. And it's not what I've, experienced in my world before. So that's probably one of the starkest differences in police and private protection. And also, the transition for me, I always say, and I was always responsible for the last 10 feet. I've spent, 20 odd years looking after various ministers and members of the royal family. I spent the last 5 years of my career looking after the Prince of Wales, and wherever I went, I was, the smallest ring of security in greater rings of exterior security, normally provided by some other body. And it might be the police, it might be private sector, it might be military, it could be a foreign agency, whatever that might be. But, my responsibility was the last 10 feet, as I always used to say. Now, certainly in my current role, the Commonwealth Games, I've got a stadium that's probably got a perimeter of something like, 2 or 3 miles. With hundreds of CCTV cameras, hundreds of security officers, and I'm now responsible for those outer rings of security that I always used to enter. And I was always conscious of it, but I just don't think I understood the magnitude of the operation, the greater operation, because I was more inwardly focused rather than, externally focused. So yeah, that's a big thing for me. It has been a big thing for me.
It's great to hear you talk about your transition from the police into the private sector, and I hear some of the things you're talking about there, and I think, I couldn't agree more. And like you said, the last 10 feet, that's what you considered your position when you were working within the police, in the royalty protection. And it's a huge, massive learning curve, isn't it? Going from doing that all the way up to, controlling all of these events. You've been to these events previously, and you focused on, you've done your advance, you've sent someone there, you know exactly what you're doing. But when you're controlling the different layers, which could be different companies, it could be different standards of training for each of these individuals, and there's so many cogs that can go wrong when you were just focused on your principle previously. It is a huge learning curve coming into the private sector. So going back to CP anyway, what do you think the ideal background of a protector is if they're not from the police or the military? Do you think there's common character traits or a common theme that a good protector should have?
Well, absolutely. I've often said, and I've been involved in police training, not just close protection, but general training as well, conflict management, recruit training. So I've got a training background going back, 25 years. Working in the police, I always used to say, if you're a good police officer, then you can be a good protection officer. And the police officer bit isn't particularly relevant. It's about just being a good communicator, having that ability to interpret situations. And I've worked with people. There's always people. I watch these debates all the time about, do you need to be incredibly fit? Do you need to be the best shot? Do you need to be the best, martial art, whatever it might be? And I think really you want an amalgamation of all those things, kind of jack of all, master of none. I've worked with lots of people who might be the best shot in the world, but they can't talk to people. I've worked with people who might be highly proficient in, boxing, martial arts, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, whatever it might be. But when someone's pointing a gun at you, or they've got a knife, then, those skills can be quite irrelevant. But what will always get you out of trouble is your head and your mouth, because you can always be, outnumbered. You can always be overcome by, people who've got an ability. They've got access to more weapons than you've got, whatever it might be, wherever you are in the world. And I've been lucky enough in my work to work in over 50 countries across the world, from war zones, failed states, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia. And I can think of situations that I've been in when it doesn't matter what your close protection skills are. The thing that's got me and our teams out of trouble is your ability to think on your feet, not to offend people, to communicate well. So I think those traits are very, very important. And anyone who thinks they can rely on their fists or a gun, to manage their way out of any close protection, conundrum or event is probably not the right person. Well, it won't be the right person for my team. I'd much rather have somebody who can think on the feet. Might not be the best shot in the world or the strongest individual, but they're not going to get me into a lot of trouble.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we have different backgrounds. You're ex-police, I'm from the military, but it's an accumulation of skills. And what I find is, people be great at one thing, they might be not so great at another. But I think what people need to be a good protector, they need to be dedicated to the craft, and applying themselves. People who get up and I don't know. They've got to get up and go, they keep themselves in shape. They study, they further develop them.
Absolutely.
So I think all of these accumulation of a lot of things.
Yeah. And fitness is important. I mean, I'm not decrying that in any way. It is important. You have to be able to, look after yourself. You have to be able to look after your principal. You've got to be realistic in that. And, certainly in the police, I've worked with people who, I retired at 30 years. I made my decision I was going to go at 30 years. Luckily for me, that was at age 49. I'm still, touch wood, not in too much of a bad shape. But I have worked with people in close protection who others might look at and say, well, you're clearly well past your prime. And probably physically they have been, but for experience and knowledge and their abilities to communicate and manage people and get what they want, they are very, very good. And it's got to be a blend of all those things, I think, Sean. Like you said, fitness is very important. You've got to be fit. If you're doing protection at 60 years old, then you've got to have an element of fitness. But yeah, an amalgamation of all those things, I think, is very, very important, rather than just relying on one or two aspects.
Absolutely. And I like that, because that plays into de-escalation. And I think a few episodes ago, we had Joe Saunders with a chapter of his book, Judo Skills Pay the Bills, but also verbal judo. Which I think is interesting.
Yeah,
is that a myth?
I do like that analogy, actually. I when I was a younger police officer, and I used to wrestle. That was my sport, and I wrestled for the police. I was the police national champion. In the 90s, my weight, and I was quite happily. I'd quite happily have a roll around with people, because it. And I did self-defense, and I did the conflict management. But as I got older. And certainly as I managed teams, I used to find it more of a challenge talking somebody down. And I can think of an occasion just a couple of weeks ago when we had somebody barge past the security at the stadium. And just by chance, I was walking through the site with one of the police officers who I've been working closely with from West Midlands Police. And we ended up challenging this individual. Now, clearly, I looked at him and I thought, this is a man who's quite capable in his abilities. And I actually had a rucksack on. I remember I actually took it off because I thought we are going to end up rolling around with this guy. And in the end, he clearly spent some time in prison. He was quite happy to tell us that he wasn't, even when police challenged him, said, I don't give a damn who you are, et cetera, et cetera. And I really did think that was going to end badly. But, again, using my skills that I've gained over the years, managed to talk him down. Walked out with him, and he shook my hand in the end, told me his name, I told him mine, said you can't come through, he wanted to walk right through the park the distances I had done. I suspect there was probably some mental illness in there as well, but it was a situation that years ago I know I would have ended up rolling around with that guy, but experience tells you, one, I'm going to get hurt, he's going to get hurt, who's the real winner? We can both walk away from this and carry on with our normal days.
Yeah. That's quite a stark example, and I guess those verbal judo skills that police are famed for really do translate. And people
absolutely,
people should go.
Yeah. And just one other example why I think of it. A few years ago, again, I was involved in conflict management. I remember when the SIA came into being, and I was doing some door supervisor training, and quite rightly, one of the chaps said to me, "Well, have you ever worked the door?" And I said, "Well, I've not." And he said, "Well, so you're here telling us about, this SIA qualification, and, what can you tell us about it?" And I said, "No, you're quite right. So I've never worked the door. I'm telling you this, I'm teaching you conflict management. This is a skill in itself." And then all of a sudden it came to me, and I said to him, "So what do you do when you can't manage it on the door?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, when it's gone wrong and it's, the door supervisor overwhelmed or the situation's gone out of control, what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I phoned the police." And I said, "Yeah, and that's me." And I said, "And what do you expect me to do when I come?" So, he laughed and he said, "Good point." And, it just reinforced it that you don't have to be or have to have an understanding of that specific skill, but just that generic skill set of conflict management, can help. And ultimately, as a cop, I've been involved in a lot of situations where you really are the last, person who's called in to resolve it. And, I have to say over my career, thankfully, I've managed to do that mostly without injury.
And I guess, one of the big parallels people like to make is I used to have lots of people on tap, or I had a large budget. And now I'm on my own and I don't have all these people to call. So we know that, right? We're prepared for that. But what skills beyond the verbal judo skills, what lessons do police protection officers have for the private sector? I know it's different, and I know people say, "Oh, you have to depolice your CV and this and this," but what can you bring? Is it an air of gravitas? I don't know. What is that police thing that is appealing for the private sector?
Yeah, you're right. You can tap into a number of resources. If I wanted, a building searched, or I wanted a helicopter to oversee it, whatever it was, generally, certainly if, in the field I was working in, then I could get those assets. And I've worked with, and I've had experience of private close protection, and of course you turn up and day one you say, right, yeah, I've had a little look at security, I've reviewed it, and I think we need an advance. I think we need some residential security with like a specific driver. I'm going to sit in the front seat and you are going to sit in the back. And then the client principal says, no, that's not how it works. I'm going to pay you. You're going to get this a day. And no, I don't want all those people, and just make it work. So I think that's the biggest thing. Again, transition wise, as a police officer, you kind of look at threat and risk and think this is what we need to mitigate that. When you work in the private sector, somebody says that's your budget. That's how I want it to be done. And you kind of left with that. Now, sometimes that does work in the police as well, because there's a number of principals who've had protection for a long, long time. If you get a new minister, then you can, teach them, you can, cajole them into the way that you want it to be done. But if you're turning up on a team and that person's had protection, maybe a role for a long, long time, then you kind of have to fall into how it works for them. Again, this is down to relationships. So, it doesn't work for everybody, but you've got a good relationship with your principal, you've got a good relationship with private officers and staff. It doesn't work for everybody. Sometimes, there's that natural fix, sometimes there's not. I think overall, I've worked with some really good private close protection officers, really good. And they've probably come from backgrounds where they've been involved in dealing with conflict. They've been involved in jobs that involve an awful lot of communication. And I tend to find those people are probably better. They might have worked in the job centre where they've had to deal with, angry people banging the desk and talk them down, knowing that they've not got anybody else in the job centre that's going to help resolve that situation. They've got to do it themselves. And they might not, might not have the build. They might not be the type of person who thinks they can, confront that individual. So they've got to use the mouth. They've got to use the brain. And it comes back to what I've said before. Most of security, most of protection is about using your brain and using your mouth in communications, because I love that phrase. Was it verbal judo skills?
Yeah. So he had a chapter, judo skills pay the bills, but then he plays on verbal judo, and
I like
and I think we see videos online of it being employed, and it seems to be the de-escalation skill.
Absolutely, and I do like that phrase. It does resonate with me, and I do like it. I think I'll be using that one in the future.
Very good. Well, it's not mine. It's not ours. So feel free.
I'm happily credit the person who said it.
Very good. So looking forward and a little bit of futurology. I know you've very kindly previously spoken at the CP Tech Forum that we do each January.
Yes.
The premise behind it is, what tech is coming down the line for protectors to use. We haven't really gone as far to say what tech is replacing protectors, and I know I get fan mail for that every time I say that. We don't go there, but certainly to augment their work. Lots of threat intel things. Given that you've worked in the public sector, what do you think is next coming down the line? Assuming that that's the way the conveyor belt of technology works, first in the public sector and then the private sector gets it. What are your thoughts on technology to augment the protector coming down the line?
I think I've said it, at the forum. I think it's a blend of both. We're never going to get away from the fact that you need to have somebody on the shoulder of somebody to protect them. That's thousands of years old, and I don't really see that disappearing, because that's the most fundamental part. Responsible for that last 10 feet. Most attacks are going to come in physical form. You see them. You might be able to negate them through good intelligence, good use of open source materials. But ultimately, you've got to stop that person getting near the person you're protecting. If they're intent on doing them any harm. But then you look at the news, and just recently you look at al-Zawahiri in Kabul, and you think one of these Hellfire ninja missiles comes out of the sky and just wipes him out. Now that just shows how far technology can go. I mean, historically, we'd be looking at somebody who might want to plant a bomb to assassinate somebody. They're going to use a gun, they're going to use a knife, whatever they might be. It's normally close quarters. But now we're seeing technology that can obliterate somebody from, hundreds, thousands of miles away, maybe. Now, if you are, al-Zawahiri's bodyguards, how do you mitigate against that? It's virtually impossible. So we are moving into very, very different times now. Historically, they'd have been, putting in some residential security. They might have had some, people around, plain clothes, gaining intelligence in the area. But, that will never, ever negate this new technology. So that's one thing that, I wasn't aware of, certainly a couple of months ago when we were talking about this. But generally speaking, I think that blend of physical and the virtual stuff. There's so much information out there these days. It's really, really hard to drill into what you actually need, unless it's real raw intelligence where that's been, it's been looked through, it's been graded. You could, if you're looking after, let's say, for example, Elton John in the private sector, you Google Elton John and, he's going to have lots of people who are saying things about him on the internet. How do you find out all that information that's relevant? I think it's really important, certainly, and this is one thing that maybe the private sector can learn from, the policing world is, having databases, it's common knowledge, it's on the internet, it's open source, but, this kind of fixated individual database, maybe that should come across to the private sector is something I've thought of myself. Because, through all that, when you do look back, you look at the inquiry, you work backwards, you can see generally there's a pattern of communications, and certainly technology can help that these days. I think I look back to the assassination of Spencer Percival in 1812, I think it was, the Prime Minister. And, even then I said, well, what hostile reconnaissance would somebody have done in that time? And I think even the inquiry then looked back, there's no photographs, there's no newspapers. So how did Bellingham know he was going to assassinate the Prime Minister? He had to go to Parliament. He had to ask people around which one's the Prime Minister because he didn't know what he looked like. So come the inquiry, people go, oh yeah, that chap was around asking. So yes, we can do that on the internet now. We can do it, in that medium, but also, there's people are still employing the old-fashioned techniques, of hostile reconnaissance. But again, and then this is another thing for me. It used to annoy me when I'd see my teams on television, or they didn't quite do something right. We might give up on a certain aspect. And of course, well, I'll give you an example. Years ago, I did an event, and the person I was looking after didn't want me to open the door because they didn't want to appear presidential, but I knew that was going to be on television. So I said, well, I understand that, I get that, but this is how it will work for me. We'll arrive at the venue, I'll get out of the car, I'll have a look around, and if I'm happy, I'll give you a little nod, and you can get out of the car yourself. Now, that way, when that's being watched on TV, at least anyone doing the hostile reconnaissance can think, the police are doing it properly. I know another colleague of mine who had the same scenario. He pulled up, it was televised. He sat in the car in the front seat. The principal got out into the public. And of course, there were other assets around, but it just looked wrong. And I think that's the important thing is you've got to be seen to be doing your job properly as well, because years ago, people would have to stand on the pavement and watch you do it. Now they can watch you do it on, YouTube, Instagram, the BBC News, Sky, whatever. So, yeah, technology can work with you and it can also work against you.
Yeah, and that's negotiation as well. That's managing your principal and managing
absolutely.
The expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The Department of yes, but
there's a lot of grey in protection. It's not black and white. We were always working in shades of grey, and it is negotiating. And again, negotiating with the principal said, I understand what you're saying, but again, in 20 years of protection, I'm quite proud. I've never, ever said no to a principal. And there's been a couple of hairy moments, particularly abroad when a principal's wanted to do something. There's always a common ground. There's always a negotiation. There's always a compromise. So, yeah, it's definitely, again, those skills coming out, communication, compromise. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we had someone on a few months ago. The only scenario anyone seems to concretely agree is when they want to go potholing. That's no. But,
well, I've done that myself. I've never done it with a principal. I've done some other random stuff, but yeah, there's always a way.
Perfect. Well, what's next for you? And are you starting to mentor, write, do some things on the academic side, or are you firmly in the private sector now?
I mean, I've done, like I said, I've been involved in teaching. I used to teach at the College of Policing on security, certainly on the close protection side. I've done it in the police. I've done it outside the police. So yeah, I enjoy teaching. I enjoy passing on the experiences, the knowledge that I've got. It's something I will do into the future as well. Writing, people always say, "Oh, you're going to do a book and all this sort of stuff." I don't really think I've got the time. I mean, I've got plenty of interesting, anecdotes and stories, but I think if I did something, it would be factual. But from here on, I mean, my contract with the Commonwealth Games ends in about a week's time, I think, just over a week. So I've got a little bit of work, some jobs that'll probably take me up till about November time, and then I'll probably take a little bit of time off because I've worked for 30 years. I had a week off before I started this job. So yeah, but no, I'm definitely firmly involved and integrated into the close protection sector, both police and private. And yeah, looking for work. So if anyone's got anything for me out there, I'll happily consider. But yeah, I would like very much so to be involved in the professional development as we continue. I was involved in some of the consultative groups, Skills for Security, the SIA, the Close Protection Forum, things like that a few years ago. Maybe I've got some more time to get involved in things like that. I'm very much for professional standards and maintaining the levels that should be involved in the security world.
Absolutely. Well, that's great news. I feel that's a really good thing to have. Sean, anything more for Scott? We've run down the clock.
It's been great listening to you, actually, Scott. I love hearing the transition from people, military to private sector, police to private sector. It's great listening to your story. It's great that you're looking to put back into the industry, and so that people can learn from your experiences, and you teach people what you've learned. And I always find, I was picked up on your story about the door supervisor. I thought that was fascinating as well. Who do you call when this spirals out of control? What we call the police. And it's just you're at a level, or you've trained to a level and delivered at a level that's beyond a door supervision license or whatever. I always find, personally myself as well, if I was going to do a door supervisor course, you'd learn from them because they do that every day. And I know guys that work full time in the CP sector, but they actually purposely go and do door supervision. I asked them, one guy I know really well, I said, you're on a full time CP gig, you're really well paid. Why do you go to do all these extra shifts? And he says, I like to do so many shifts on the doors or at events. And it wasn't the top up money, he says, because it keeps me sharp in you're using your communication skills, your situational awareness. He says, absolutely. I like to do it. And he says, that's why I do it. So even though he's delivering at this level,
I mean,
sure.
You've just reminded me, if we've got time, I know I've got to get on this 10 o'clock, but it's definitely a good story when it comes to conflict management. And it's true, I did I think it was an 1886 City and Guilds conflict management course a good number of years ago. And I remember talking to this chap, I remember his name, he was John, he was from the Northeast, he worked the doors. And he was telling me he'd worked the doors for a number of years. He said, I've never been assaulted. And I said, I don't believe you work in Newcastle and you've never been. He said, no. And I said, I want to hear this story. And he told me that if people came to the door and, they had trainers on, he'd always give something back. So, the story would go, somebody came to the door, sorry, mate, you're not allowed in tonight, no trainers. Of course, they've had a few beers, they're upset, blah, blah. He said, look, it's not a problem. Here's my card. He said, next week you come in, you walk to the front of the queue, you ask for me, and I'll get you in. So straight away, he's taken the anger out of the situation. He's given somebody a way out, and I think this is really important. You've always, when people are angry, you've got to give them an escape avenue that's mutually beneficial. Again, if somebody didn't have a tie, he'd have a tie in his pocket rather than say, There was always something he greeted, and this is what I look for in security. And I've seen there's a great chap working with me. I won't name him by embarrassing him. But he's a door supervisor as well. He's working on one of my sites within the stadium, and I moved him because I said, you're wasted in the position you're in. I want you front of the house. He's smart. He's definitely got presence. He works the doors in Birmingham, but he knows everybody. Going back to John's story in Newcastle, he would individually speak to everybody coming to that club. He's got eye contact with them. He's said hello. He's solved some of the problems he might have. And when it kicked off, as inevitably it will in a Newcastle nightclub, after a certain period of time, when everyone's got a few beers inside them, he'd go in. And of course, somebody would pick up bottles, and he said he'd seen it. They'd literally pick a bottle up, and somebody in the crowd would say, "No, not him. Leave him alone." And that's because he'd made an introduction, he made that connection with people, so they had something, they had a relationship already. And that, that's what I learned in that 1886 course, was that ability, that communication that he ensured every single time with every interaction, kept him safe. 20 years working the doors in Newcastle and never been serious. That's ongoing.
Yeah, I mean that's just oozing experience. It's giving respect. And you get that respect back. Yeah, it's great.
No, so thanks, gentlemen. Really appreciate the opportunity and the time. I'm more than happy to do something for you in the future.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Scott. From Sean and myself, this has been another fantastic edition of the Circuit Magazine podcast. What a wealth of experience, and great to hear some really good case studies. Of course, with someone with such a career, you're always wondering, how far can I ask? How much can I ask? And I'm grateful for Scott supporting this topic. And of course, he said at the end, he is willing to reach out. He is looking to forge a new path in the private sector. So yes, I suppose the point of this podcast is to help elaborate on that transition from police to the private sector. But since it's live and in motion, I think this is a good juncture to sort of bring people together as well. What have you taken away from today's session, Sean?
I think everyone can take something away from that. And certainly for them people looking to transition from military or police, to listen to how Scott's done it, how he's moved into the sector, what he's doing now. And, I think for any employer out there, he's just touted himself out. We've got a great guy there, huge experience, who is going to become available. Who wouldn't want to use that guy on the team to teach the team, deliver the lessons he's learned over a sterling career? I'm sure someone will be in touch with Scott after this, and I'm sure there'll be many people in touch. Great guy. Love it. Well, yeah, please do reach out. And if this story resonates with you, let's have you comment on the BBA Connect app or the NABA Protector app, because I think we've really struck a chord, something that relates to a lot of us. Actually, on that note, I know we've just done a few major upgrades on the BBA Connect app and the NABA Protector app, so you should notice some distinct improvements. I'm grateful to everyone who continues to comment and post and put motivational things up there. In addition to that, I know that the community is waking up from summer a little bit and starting lots of different events. Our colleague Elijah, of course, is running his course in a few months. I will see at least a few BBA members over in Phoenix, as well as, of course, some NABA members, because I'm running the 6th annual Physical Cyber Convergence Forum in Phoenix on the 18th of August. So you know who you are, but you're flying all the way out there. And I think that's a nice cross-pollination between the associations as well. So definitely looking forward to that. On your side, Sean, what have you got coming up? What have our asks of the community, perhaps relating to the magazine? Same as always, we have the latest issue of the Circuit magazine coming to you shortly. Still, looking for articles for this and future issues of the magazine. We're looking for anyone who's interested in appearing on the podcast, and our members would love to hear from you, our listeners. And for myself personally, a lot of travel coming up. New times for me as well, also. Subcontracting from other security companies now as well as carrying out my own work. It's great getting myself out there and working with different teams now, which I haven't done for a long time, but it's great meeting new people in the industry and growing that network further.
But good. Well, keep all the comments coming. Keep the reposts of the podcast coming, because that, of course, spreads the word and grows the community. But wonderful to finally have Scott on. I know Scott has joined a number of our forums for a number of years, and now, he has, of course, more sort of ability, leeway to, elaborate on skills. I know we joked about judo skills pay the bills and verbal judo skills. Which I'm sure will, hark back to a few different episodes. Good. So transitioning from the police to the private sector in EP, what an important topic, what a crucial topic. Let's give Scott Hamer a virtual round of applause. And from Sean and myself, this has been another fantastic edition of the Circuit Magazine podcast.
You have been listening to the Circuit Magazine podcast. Be sure to subscribe and be sure to not miss an episode.